There is something strange about the history of Ukraine. Look at a modern map, and everything seems simple. A country, a border, a capital, a flag. But erase those borders and begin moving backward through time, and the picture changes completely. Borders move, names disappear, cities change hands, powerful rulers arrive and eventually vanish, yet something remains. For centuries, the land we now call Ukraine stood at one of Europe's most dangerous crossroads, a place where different worlds repeatedly collided. People came here looking for trade, others came looking for territory, and some came looking for absolute control. But controlling the land was one thing. Controlling the people who lived on it was something very different. Because governments can collapse, borders can be erased, armies can conquer cities, but identity can survive in places where power cannot reach. Inside language, inside songs, inside religion, inside family stories passed quietly from one generation to the next. And this is where Ukraine's story becomes fascinating, because its history is not a straight line from ancient times to the modern world. It is a story of disappearing borders, competing identities, forgotten rulers, and a land repeatedly caught between much larger powers. At certain moments, this region stood near the center of European history. At others, it almost disappeared from the political map, and yet the story continued, again and again and again. So forget the borders you know today. Imagine the map completely empty, no modern countries, no familiar political boundaries, only enormous rivers, forests, fertile plains, and open grasslands stretching toward the horizon. Now ask one question. How did this land eventually become Ukraine? The answer begins more than 1,000 years before the country we recognize today. And once you uncover what happened here, the modern map of Eastern Europe begins to look very different. Ukraine stands at one of the great crossroads of Europe. For thousands of years, armies, merchants, nomads, kings, and empires have crossed its fertile plains. Kingdoms rose here. Empires fought over its territory. Borders repeatedly disappeared and returned. Yet through centuries of conquest, division, famine, revolution, and war, a distinct Ukrainian identity continued to develop. To understand modern Ukraine, we have to travel far back in time, long before Ukraine, Russia, or many of Europe's modern nations existed. Human settlement in the lands of present-day Ukraine stretches deep into prehistory. One of the most remarkable early cultures was the Tripilia culture, which flourished thousands of years before the birth of Christ. Its people practiced agriculture, produced decorated pottery, and built surprisingly large settlements. Later, the enormous grasslands of southern Ukraine became home to nomadic peoples. Among the most famous were the Scythians, skilled horsemen who dominated much of the Pontic steppe during the first millennium BC. Greek colonists also established trading cities along the Black Sea coast, connecting the region to the wider Mediterranean world. Over the centuries, Goths, Huns, Khazars, and other peoples moved through these lands. But by the early medieval period, East Slavic communities had become increasingly important across the forest and river valleys of the region. The Dnipro River became one of the great highways of medieval Europe. Traders could travel from the Baltic world in the north toward the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire in the south. Scandinavian warriors and merchants known as Varangians became involved in these trade networks and in the politics of the East Slavic lands. By the late 9th century, Kyiv emerged as the center of a powerful medieval state, known today as Kyivan Rus. Kyiv's position was ideal. Located along the Dnipro, it controlled important commercial routes, linking northern Europe with Constantinople. Under rulers such as Ole, Ihor, and Sviatoslav, the state expanded. But one of the most consequential moments came during the reign of Volodymyr the Great. In 988, Volodymyr adopted Byzantine Christianity. The conversion connected Kyivan Rus more closely with the Christian world, centered on Constantinople. Churches and monasteries appeared. Literacy and religious literature expanded. Byzantine artistic and architectural traditions influenced the region. Under Yaroslav the Wise in the 11th century, Kyiv entered a period of extraordinary prosperity. The magnificent St. Sophia Cathedral became a symbol of the city's wealth and importance. Dynastic marriages connected Yaroslav's family with royal houses across Europe. But Kyivan Rus was not a modern nation-state, and its legacy would eventually become important to the histories and identities of several East Slavic peoples, especially Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. After Yaroslav's era, competition among princes weakened political unity. Then came catastrophe from the east. In the 13th century, Mongol armies swept across Eastern Europe. Kyiv was captured and devastated in 1240. The political center that had once dominated the region never fully recovered its former position. In western parts of the old Rus lands, however, the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia emerged as an important successor state and maintained connections with Central and Eastern Europe. Over the following centuries, much of what is now Ukraine came under the influence or control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This brought Ukrainian lands into closer contact with Polish and Lithuanian political institutions and with both Catholic and Orthodox traditions. But social and religious tensions grew. Many Orthodox Ruthenian peasants lived under powerful landowners, while political authority was concentrated among the nobility. Along Ukraine's southern frontier, another force was emerging. They became known as the Cossacks. The Cossacks were frontier warriors whose communities attracted peasants, adventurers, and others seeking greater freedom on the dangerous steppe borderlands. Their most famous center became the Zaporizhian Sich, located beyond the rapids of the Dnipro. The Cossacks developed their own military traditions and political institutions. They fought Tatars and Ottomans, served different rulers at different times, and became increasingly important in the politics of Eastern Europe. By the 17th century, tensions inside the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were reaching a breaking point. In 1648, Cossack leader Bohdan Khmelnytsky launched a massive uprising against Polish rule. Cossack armies won dramatic early victories, and the rebellion transformed the political landscape of the region. Khmelnytsky established what became known as the Cossack Hetmanate, a political and military order that occupies an important place in the history of Ukrainian statehood. But the new Hetmanate was surrounded by powerful rivals. Poland-Lithuania remained dangerous. The Crimean Khanate pursued its own interests. The Ottoman Empire stood to the south, while the growing Tsardom of Muscovy lay to the northeast. Seeking military support, Khmelnytsky entered into an agreement with Tsar Alexei of Muscovy at Pereyaslav in 1654. The exact political meaning of this agreement became disputed over subsequent centuries. What is clear is that it brought Muscovy directly into the struggle for Ukraine and profoundly changed the balance of power in Eastern Europe. War continued. Ukraine became increasingly divided, and the decades that followed were marked by political instability, shifting alliances, and conflict, a period remembered as the ruin. By the 18th century, the Russian Empire was steadily reducing the autonomy of the Cossack Hetmanate. Hetman Ivan Mazepa attempted to break from Peter the Great during the Great Northern War by siding with Sweden. But in 1709, Swedish and Allied forces were defeated by Peter at the Battle of Poltava. The Russian Empire's influence over Ukrainian lands grew stronger. Later in the 18th century, the remaining institutions of Cossack autonomy were dismantled, and the Zaporizhian Sich was destroyed on the orders of Catherine the Great. At roughly the same time, the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth redrew the map of Eastern Europe. Most Ukrainian lands eventually came under the Russian Empire, while significant Western territories fell under Habsburg rule. Ukraine had once again been divided between great powers. But during the 19th century, something important began to happen. Writers, historians, intellectuals, and ordinary people increasingly turned toward Ukrainian language, folklore, culture, and history. Among the most influential was the poet Taras Shevchenko, whose writings became deeply connected with the development of modern Ukrainian national consciousness. A people divided between empires was beginning to imagine a different political future. And when those empires began collapsing during the First World War, Ukraine would seize its opportunity. The struggle that followed would be one of the most chaotic and consequential periods in Ukrainian history. The First World War shattered the empires that had ruled Ukrainian lands for generations. In 1917, revolution brought down the Russian monarchy. As authority collapsed, Ukrainian political leaders in Kyiv created the Central Rada and demanded greater autonomy. Soon, the Ukrainian People's Republic was proclaimed. For the first time in generations, an independent Ukrainian state seemed possible. But independence came amid chaos. Bolshevik forces, Ukrainian national armies, Polish troops, White Russian forces, anarchists, and foreign armies struggled for control across the region. Governments rose and fell with astonishing speed. In western Ukraine, the collapse of Austria-Hungary produced another Ukrainian state, the West Ukrainian People's Republic. Its forces soon fought Poland over control of eastern Galicia and the important city of Lviv. After years of warfare, the Ukrainian independence movements were defeated. Most Ukrainian territory became part of the newly created Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, while several Western Ukrainian territories remained outside Soviet control. During the 1920s, Soviet authorities initially permitted a degree of Ukrainian cultural development. Ukrainian language education expanded, literature flourished, and a new generation of writers and artists emerged. But under Joseph Stalin, Soviet policy changed dramatically. Beginning in the late 1920s, agriculture was forcibly collectivized. Independent farms were reorganized into collective farms controlled by the Soviet state. The transformation was violent and deeply disruptive. Then, in 1932 and 1933, catastrophe struck. A devastating famine swept through Soviet Ukraine and other grain-producing regions of the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, this famine became known as the Holodomor. Millions died as hunger devastated villages and families. Soviet policies, including grain requisitions and restrictions on movement, greatly intensified the disaster. Ukraine recognizes the Holodomor as genocide, as do a number of other countries and institutions. Historians continue to examine questions concerning Stalin's intentions and the famine's broader Soviet context, but its devastating human consequences are beyond dispute. At the same time, Stalin's government carried out political repression against intellectuals, religious leaders, officials, artists, and many others. A generation of Ukrainian cultural figures was imprisoned, executed, or silenced. Then Europe descended into another enormous war. In 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Territories with large Ukrainian populations that had been under Polish rule were incorporated into Soviet Ukraine. 2 years later, Hitler turned against Stalin. In June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Ukraine became one of the central battlefields of the Second World War. Cities were destroyed. Villages were burned. Millions of civilians and soldiers died. The Nazi occupation also brought the Holocaust to Ukrainian territory. Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were systematically murdered. At Babin Yar near Kyiv, tens of thousands of Jews were shot in one of the most infamous mass killings of the Holocaust. Ukrainians experienced the war in different ways. Millions fought in the Soviet Red Army, while nationalist organizations pursued an independent Ukrainian state. Some individuals collaborated with occupying forces while others resisted them. The period remains complex and deeply contested. By 1944, Soviet forces had driven the German military from most of Ukraine. When the war ended, Ukraine was devastated. Yet reconstruction began quickly. Factories, mines, railways, and cities were rebuilt. Ukraine once again became one of the Soviet Union's most important industrial and agricultural republics. The post-war decades brought urbanization, education, scientific development, and industrial growth. But political power remained firmly controlled by the Communist Party. Expressions of Ukrainian nationalism were restricted, and Soviet authorities promoted Russian language and culture in many areas while suppressing dissident movements. Then, in 1986, disaster struck northern Ukraine. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. Radioactive material spread across large areas of Europe. The Soviet government's initial secrecy surrounding the accident damaged public trust and became one of the most powerful symbols of the weaknesses of the late Soviet system. Only 5 years later, that system began to collapse. On August 24, 1991, Ukraine's parliament declared independence from the Soviet Union. The decision was put directly to the people. On December 1st, Ukrainians went to the polls. More than 90% of those who voted supported independence, with majorities voting in favor across every region of the country. The Soviet Union dissolved later that month. For the first time in the modern era, Ukraine existed as a widely recognized independent state. But independence brought enormous challenges. The 1990s were marked by economic decline, inflation, corruption, and political uncertainty as Ukraine transitioned from the Soviet system toward a market economy and democratic institutions. Ukraine also inherited a huge Soviet nuclear arsenal. Through international agreements, it gave up those nuclear weapons and joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. In the following decades, Ukraine increasingly faced a difficult question about its geopolitical future and the nature of its relationships with Russia and Western institutions. In 2004, disputed presidential election results triggered enormous demonstrations known as the Orange Revolution. Protesters demanded a fair election, and a repeat vote eventually brought Viktor Yushchenko to the presidency. But Ukraine's political divisions and struggles over corruption continued. Another decisive moment came in late 2013. President Viktor Yanukovych suspended preparations for an association agreement with the European Union. Protesters gathered in Kyiv's Independence Square, known as the Maidan. What began as demonstrations supporting closer European integration grew into a much larger protest movement against corruption and government abuses. After months of confrontation and deadly violence, Yanukovych left Kyiv in February 2014 and was removed from presidential authority by parliament. Ukraine entered a new and dangerous period. Russia seized control of Crimea and subsequently annexed the peninsula in March 2014, a move rejected by Ukraine and widely condemned internationally. War also erupted in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, where Russian-backed separatist forces fought Ukrainian government troops. Russia denied being a direct party to the conflict while supporting the separatist entities. Russian military involvement was extensively documented. For 8 years, the conflict continued, despite repeated attempts to negotiate peace. Then, on February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces attacked from multiple directions, including from Russia, Belarus, and occupied Crimea. Many observers initially expected Kyiv to fall quickly. It did not. Ukrainian forces defended the capital, while President Volodymyr Zelensky remained in Kyiv. Russia withdrew from northern Ukraine after failing to capture the capital, but fighting continued across the east and south. Cities including Mariupol were devastated. Millions of Ukrainians fled their homes, creating one of Europe's largest refugee crises since the Second World War. Ukraine received extensive military, financial, and humanitarian support from the United States, European countries, and other international partners. The war also strengthened Ukraine's connections with European institutions. In 2022, Ukraine received candidate status for membership in the European Union. The full-scale invasion transformed Ukrainian society and intensified a national identity that had developed through centuries of changing borders, imperial rule, cultural revival, revolution, independence, and conflict. Ukraine's history cannot be reduced to its relationship with any single neighboring country. Its story includes the legacy of Kyivan Rus, centuries under Lithuania and Poland, the Cossack Hetmanate, rule by the Russian and Habsburg empires, Soviet Ukraine, and the creation of an independent republic in 1991. From the ancient settlements of the Ukrainian steppe to the churches of medieval Kyiv, from the Cossacks of the Dnipro to the struggle for independence, Ukraine has repeatedly been transformed by its position at the crossroads of Europe. And today that history is still being written. The final chapter has not yet been written, but understanding the centuries that came before helps explain why Ukraine, its independence, and its identity remain so consequential to the history of Europe and the wider world.